Hi all, Anthony Wilson, your Public Information Officer for the City of San Angelo. And today we're going to talk a little bit about not only drought level 1, which we moved into those restrictions yesterday, but how our parks system is responding to drought level 1, because they are taking some very proactive measures in order to conserve water now that we are in drought level 1. And so I have with me here today Roger Havlock. Roger is our Senior Parks Manager, and he's going to say aw shucks about this because this is the sort of guy that he is. But I always say, I hope to someday know just a scintilla of any one subject compared to what Roger knows about turf grass, because he is expert at it. In fact, I have been in places where the famed John Begnode has come to hear Roger talk about grass and horticulture. So Roger, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, Anthony.
So first and foremost, we're now in drought level 1, which restricts our watering to once a week, no more than 1 inch per week, and never between noon and 6 p.m.
Correct.
Does the city's Parks Department follow the watering restrictions?
Yes, Anthony, we've had to follow the ordinance ever since I started back in 2006. So the answer to the question is yes. We have to follow all ordinances just like the general public does.
And so what safeguards do you have in place to ensure that parks and sports fields are being watered in accordance with whatever the restrictions are at any given time?
Okay, so we actually do a lot of things just in terms of water conservation. We do irrigation audits where we actually put out catch cups to figure out what our application rate is. We also do that to see how uniform of distribution of the water for the system. We do system checks almost on a monthly basis on all our systems. And we've started to switch over to a new central control system where we can actually alter the programs sitting at the office. And so it's really helped us a lot in terms of being able to be more effective, more efficient. We don't have to send people out when it's about to rain or when it's raining to try to get them turned off and those sorts of things. So yeah, we've really tried hard to be proactive in that sense. And then here recently, we've went ahead and switched to every other week watering on many of our parks due to the drought 1 situation. And so hopefully that'll help out a lot too.
Well, and I think that speaks to how important water conservation is to you and to the Parks Department. If you're already watering some of our facilities just once every other week, why is water conservation so important? Maybe to you personally, but to the Parks Department for sure.
Right. Well, you know, water is obviously one of our greatest natural resources that we have, and we need to conserve it. But you know, with the city being in the shape that it's in, with the amount of water that we have left, I think it's only smart that not only the Parks Department but others realize that, and should have already realized that it's important to make sure that when you do water, you water appropriately, and not either use too little water where you're basically wasting water, or put too much water down and then you're wasting water. And so, again, we do a lot of things. We take soil probes out almost on a daily basis to even figure out even if we need to water or not. And so we're checking soils before we water, we're checking soils after we water to make sure that we get a good depth into that soil profile. And so, yeah, water conservation is extremely important.
So all those measures, it sounds like, make sure that you're making the most effective and efficient use of the water that you are using.
That's right, and that's what we try to do. You know, the old saying around for many, many years has been, you know, 1 inch per week during the summer. And in some cases, that's fine. You may actually need more than that, but our ordinance states that we can't. And so again, going back to that audit, it gives you the opportunity to figure out how long you need to run your system to get that inch of water. And that's what we try to do with all of our systems, is try to get that timing down. There's also calculations that you can make. You know, and I use this, gosh, almost on a daily basis, to where you can actually use a figure. It's what I call the 0.62 method. And so what that means is that for every inch of water that you put down, you're actually putting down 0.62 gallons per square foot of water. And so, for instance, if you have, like most homeowners here, have about 5,000 square feet of landscape, usually about 2,000 in the front, 3,000 in the back, something like that. 5,000 times 0.62 is 3,100. So it takes roughly 3,100 gallons to put 1 inch of water down for their landscape. If they're having to water 4 times a month because we hadn't received any rain like we did here in July, that would be roughly 12,000 gallons. And so if they look at their water bill, and that's what we do, we look at the water bill when it comes in. I have a chart that tells me how many gallons each park that we're watering can use in a month. And obviously if we're over that 4-inch mark for the gallonage for that area, then we know there's a problem. And so homeowners, I think, can use that as well.
It must be much more complicated, though, when you're dealing not just in square feet, but acreage.
Well, that's what makes, you had mentioned conservation, and that's why we feel it's so important, is because we're not dealing with the 5,000 square feet. I don't have a park that's probably less than 25,000 square feet, and our largest area is 55 acres out at the sports complex off Bell Street. And so you're talking about an acre being 43,560 square feet. You're talking a lot of square feet. And so it takes a lot of water to put 1 inch down, not only at the sports complex, but at some of our larger parks. And so it's only in our best interest, because everyone that works at the Parks Department, for the most part, lives in San Angelo. And so it's important to them, it's important to me, and obviously it's important to the general public that we pay attention to what we're doing.
And I think one of the things that may be important for folks to know is just a little bit about your background, Roger. You're not a Johnny-come-lately to water conservation, because you grew up in this area in Rowena in a farming family. So water, for farmers, water is always top of mind.
That's right, and we depended on rainfall. And we were constantly checking moisture to see if we can plant, see what the next step might be. It's really no different now. When you're dealing with park situations that have irrigation systems, there's always going to be issues. And so having them checked, having people call in to let us know when they see a problem is something that we actually really appreciate, because we're spread out all over town and we don't have enough employees to be there either when it's irrigating or even when it's not. If we get a busted diaphragm in that system, in that valve, basically that system goes on by itself. We don't control that. And so those things do happen. And so when we have a zone that's been on for 10 hours or something, obviously if we don't know about it, we want to know about it. And so they can always contact us, and we thank them. We want them to contact us to let us know so we can deal with that situation.
In fact, I saw this figure recently, but I know there are approximately 50 parks workers covering how many acres of parkland are you guys responsible for?
We cover about 550 acres. That includes all the hardscapes, parking lots, and everything. But yeah, we have a little over 50 employees, but we do a little bit of everything. We do sports field maintenance, we do park maintenance, we do a lot of projects. We build or renovate our own parks instead of contracting out, and so we have the employees for that as well.
So you mentioned that some of your facilities, now that drought level 1 has taken effect, you've gone beyond just watering once a week to once every other week. How did you go about determining which facilities to water once a week versus those that you're watering every other week now?
Okay, so we've been thinking about this for quite some time, and so one of the things that I've mentioned to our staff is that what we want to do is prepare, and we've been preparing all year for this. That means proper mowing, proper fertilization, proper irrigation, so that you build that root system to get it ready, whether it be trees, landscape plants, turf, what have you. And so going through that process, we felt as we were getting into July that most of our sites were in really good shape. We've done good weed control, we've watched out for diseases, tried to take care of any insect issues. Again, just kind of doing all the cultural practices right to try to get everything ready. And then at that point, we started looking at what areas, do we want to start cutting back on. The areas that we want to probably keep at probably a weekly watering right now and stay within the ordinance are those that we either reseeded or we resodded some areas this past spring and summer. And so those areas haven't developed a good root system yet. It's not fully developed. And so hopefully we can kind of carry them along for a little bit further. The sports complex, obviously, off Bell Street is a huge investment. And so it's important for us to probably carry some of that on. What we've talked about doing, though, is actually identifying areas, even within the park or the sports fields, that we would continue to water once a week. And the other areas, maybe the areas that are not used as much, we could cut those back to once every other week. And again, it's important, we don't want to end up with bare ground, especially on our high-use facilities. And so if we can continue those with an inch per week if we need to, I think it's important to sustain that for providing a safe surface for people to play on and have their activities on. But yeah, that's kind of what we've been doing. Even in the parks themselves, we have areas that are irrigated curb to curb. Doesn't necessarily mean that that'll be the areas that we would continue once a week on. It may be just the ball field area or the open field area where we know we have a lot of play. We have a lot of people that practice there, they have games there, all sorts of things. And so, again, trees are just a whole nother situation. We may want to keep the drip irrigation going once a week on the trees and the landscape plants. But again, I think the main thing is that we're going to closely monitor each of those sites to make sure that we don't go backwards. We've worked so hard to get them to this condition, we don't want to lose a lot of ground. And obviously, if we get in drought level 2, most likely most of our sites, if not all, will be in once every other week, even though the ordinance doesn't state that. And then, of course, with drought level 3, we shut everything off.
So you mentioned about the investment in the Texas Bank Sports Complex. And I want to be really clear about this because what you're talking about is a public investment. In other words, tax dollars have been used in order to build and support that facility, which does contribute to the economy here because of all the tournaments and so forth that it hosts. And so when you're talking about an investment, you're talking about public dollars that have been invested in that, and so watering it to some extent protects that investment.
What we keep talking about at our office is sustainability at this point. We're not trying to necessarily recover. We're not looking for aesthetics. We're looking for sustainability. If I can sustain the turf, if I can sustain the trees, the landscape plants, I think we'll be in pretty good shape.
So what will happen to the aesthetics of those places that you're only going to be watering once every other week? And of course, we're in one of the 2 hottest months of the year right now in August.
They're going to fall very quickly. Probably within 7 to 10 days, most of them will start browning in certain areas, and by the second week, we may have areas that almost go totally brown, or a tan color, whatever you want to call it. And so, yeah, we expect that. But again, our focus not only is the leaf tissue area, which obviously will get damaged and stressed, but our root system. And so hopefully we can continue with at least once every other week on those sites. And I think we'll be okay. Like I said, we've tried to build up to this point to where I think we're in pretty good shape.
And so people have accused us on our Facebook page of just being interested in having these lush green parks. And so what I'm hearing you say is watering is really not about having green parks as much as it is protecting the public investment there, sustaining that investment of the turf. And then also you mentioned previously making sure there's a safe playing surface for kids or adults or whoever might be recreating in those spaces.
Correct.
And so talk a little bit about how it is that turf provides that safe playing surface.
Well, whether it's natural turf or whether it's artificial turf, you have to have something that has somewhat of a cushion to it. You've probably been on fields, I know I have, where they're either bare ground or they're as hard as concrete, even with some turf on it. And so we try to provide surfaces that at least have somewhat of a cushion because obviously the impact on whether it's young children or even adults, older adults even, can be substantial if they're landing on a hard surface. And so again, going through those practices, aerification, water management, fertility, again, we're just trying to provide a good surface. We're not looking at state-of-the-art, we're not college level, pro level fields, that type of thing. But again, if we can maintain to a point to where we feel our parks and our sports fields are safe, that's where we want to be. And so to us, it's extremely important because safety is like our #1 mission within the Parks Department.
So I'm going to touch on some of the questions and concerns that we've seen on our Facebook page about watering in parks. And you touched on this a little earlier, but sometimes we get reports of sprinkler systems that are running during prohibited hours, that being from noon to 6, or that are dropping water onto the pavement and then causing runoff. When those things happen, what's typically the cause?
Well, again, we mentioned it earlier. You can have problems, malfunctions within the system itself that can cause those issues. Or if there's a mistake made by an employee who sets the controller incorrectly, obviously that can happen. Typically, if we're going to be watering between noon to 6, it's normally when we're going to be either seeding, sodding, establishing, and we get a landscape variance just like everybody else can, you and I can, with the general public, to be able to irrigate those during that prohibited set of hours for up to 28 days. And again, most of the time, we don't carry that through the 28 days. We monitor those sites. We'll start out with it watering during those hot periods of time during the day. But once we start getting a route established, we'll start backing off. And probably by day 14, 21, we're already watering either in the evenings only. It may be daily still, because again, you've got a limited root system there. You're still trying to get it established. But that's normally going to be the case. Again, we go back to, if someone sees water on the parks, sports fields, between noon and 6, let us know. Even if we've got a variance, that's what we're going to let them know, is that, hey, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. But if not, yes, we want to know. It's not something that we do on purpose. I just wish we had enough staff to be able to monitor every site every time that we're watering it, but it's impossible.
And so if you get a report from a citizen that some watering is going on during a prohibited hour, or there seems to be too frequent watering at a particular site, how do you and your staff respond to that?
Well, it depends on the site. Again, we get a lot of calls, just as you do, Anthony, about the sports complex, for instance, or Producers Park. These are large areas. Producers Park's roughly 12 to 13 acres, sports complex obviously around 50 acres. Well, if we use the Texas Bank Sports Complex, I have over 90 zones of irrigation there, and obviously I can't run them all at one time.
Now explain why you can't run them all at one time.
Well, again, we would never get the pressure for the water to even come out of the irrigation head, and the people are surrounding us off that same main line probably wouldn't have any water at their house. And so again, we can only water so many zones at a time throughout that complex. And so with 90 of them, we have only a certain amount of time. Even we normally can't start at 6 p.m. when others can, because we have play out there, sometimes till midnight, 1 o'clock. And so our systems usually don't come on until after midnight. And normally we have maintenance to do out there. We're mowing sometimes twice a week. So we can't water them until about maybe 7 a.m. or 8. And then they have to go off usually. And then we'll have periodic, or some areas that will actually water almost up until noon to try to make up the difference. But again, it's difficult with that many zones. So you will see systems running daily out there when we're trying to apply, but we're not running zones daily.
So each zone only gets watered now once a week,
Right,
per week.
right. And when we were in the conservation mode, we were usually, twice a week per zone, just as everybody else. And again, we monitor those sites so that we're not pushing more than 1 inch per area. Again, it may be needed, but again, it's our ordinance, and it's what we have to live by.
And so I think it's really important that people know, anytime they have given us a concern or a question about watering in parks, and I alert you guys, I alert you, I alert Mike Hitchcock, who is our deputy manager of parks, and you guys have always been super responsive about telling me, we'll go check that out immediately, and then you report back to me. So I just want people to know that you guys are really responsive whenever you get one of these calls from the public, whether it's directly from the public or it's through the Facebook page.
But it's important to us because we can lose a lot of water that shouldn't be lost or shouldn't be being applied at that time. And so the same thing goes if we have something wrong with an irrigation head. where it's shooting out into the street, or we have water running down the street. Again, we want to know about that because we need to go out and make those adjustments.
And so sometimes at the sports complex in particular, because we've had some calls about concerns about runoff there, if the wind direction changes, does that have an impact on what happens with that water once it leaves the head?
Yeah, not only the direction, but the speed of that wind. And so, yes, we have issues. We have zones or areas out there that are literally surrounded by concrete surface or pavement. And so it makes it more difficult to try to water appropriately and not get any on the street. But that's our goal. And again, when we get those calls, normally we try to take care of them as soon as our people are out there that they can handle them very quickly. But if we're not out there, we certainly want to know about it.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier about when you're reseeding or resodding new turf that you get the waiver that is allowed under the ordinance to allow for more frequent watering for up to 28 days. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what happened this past summer or earlier this summer at the dog park and at the San Angelo Soccer Association soccer field. So you mentioned about the more frequent watering having to occur sometimes during the heat of the day. Correct. From that noon to 6 p.m. period where watering is typically prohibited. Correct. So talk about why you maybe having more frequent water is intuitive to people, but why it's important also to do it during those really hot portions of the day.
Well, anytime you're going to establish, and we'll just talk strictly about turf. Anytime you're going to establish turf, whether it's sod, seed, sprigs, plugs, it doesn't matter. Initially, when you're going to place that, you need to start watering immediately as it's being laid, as it's being done, except for seeding. Once you get through seeding, then you can start watering. I always encourage people to actually pre-water. So you're actually watering bare soil, but you're trying to get water into that soil profile so that when you do seed, the only thing you have to fill is just the upper surface. Okay? And so once you get to that point, then it's just short, frequent irrigations. It's not these, I'm going to let my system run an hour. We're talking about 5-minute run times on zones, sometimes up to 20 minutes, depending on the type of head you have and the way it's distributed out. But it's so important because, and especially during the heat of the day, because once that seed, once it germinates and you have this little radical root that starts coming down into the soil, if that ever dries, it'll die immediately. Okay, it'll desiccate or dry out. And so it's important to keep it moist. And so when you see us seeding an area and we're watering, and you'll see kind of almost a sheen across the top. We're not trying to get it to where it's running water off the site or onto the hard surface. But again, we're just trying to keep it moist, especially during that critical heat period of time, normally between noon and 6. And so we'll have 1 or 2, maybe 3 waterings during that critical time just to keep it moist. It's a cooling effect for that grass. And the same goes for sod. When you're laying sod, there's no root system until it starts pegging down and starts rooting. That can take up to 2 or 3 days. In the meantime, you have to keep that canopy that's there moist and cool. It's a cooling effect. It'll keep it green, and once you go to that point, once it starts rooting, you can start backing off, because obviously that plant then is using water from the soil for uptake for its survival.
And so again, so people are clear, you, like any other property owner in the city who is establishing a new landscape, you have to apply for and obtain a waiver in order to allow for that more frequent watering from our water utilities department.
Yes, absolutely. And we do that for each of the sites.
And so here's a question that we get frequently. Does the Parks Department pay for the water it uses?
Yes, we have a budget, both at the sports complex and for the Parks Department, for all the parks and areas.
And so do you get any special rate for the use of that water? So you pay the same rate as any institutional user would, whether it's Goodfellow or Angelo State or the San Angelo School District?
Yeah, I mean, for example, I believe for the last few months we were paying like $6.07 per 1,000 gallons. And that's, I think, pretty much what everyone else would be paying. The only difference is we did get kind of a variance on it. At one point, we were being charged extra because it was in the ordinance that after 89,000 gallons, you would get this surcharge, and it was a major surcharge. We had to go to council because I don't even have a site that's less than 89,000 square feet. For the most part, we have few, but very few. Most of them are quite large. They're acres of land. And so sometimes when I would just turn on a zone or a couple of zones for an hour, I was already surpassing that 89,000 gallons. And so again, the council came back, gave us a variance off of that and said, okay, y'all will not receive the surcharge because you're still trying to stay within the ordinance of putting an inch. It's just you have a large area you're dealing with as compared to a homeowner that typically is going to be the 10,000 square feet.
And so to be clear, you have a budget that you have to adhere to as far as how much water you are allowed to use and how much you can spend on water.
That's correct. And part of that, you know, that's part of the reason why we're cutting back as well. We're getting into the end of our fiscal year. I don't have a lot of money left in that budget, but for me, it's more about conservation and not about the budget in terms of why we're going to once every other week.
And so you mentioned earlier you have about 500 acres of parkland that your department is responsible for. How much of that is irrigated?
We have viable irrigation in about 112 acres.
So only about 20% of that then is irrigated.
That's correct. Several years ago that number was higher, but now we've went so long now without irrigation at certain areas that those systems aren't even viable anymore. And so for the most part, if we're irrigating in terms of parks, we're doing about 112 acres. The sports complex is separate. That's a separate, 50, 55 acre location. And then all of the sports fields that we maintain at SASA, San Angelo Soccer Association off of Glenna, Northern Little League, Western Little League, Lakeview Little League, Ben Ficklin, East 29th Complex, those entities pay for their own water, but we help them manage that water.
And so in order to get an irrigation system installed, my understanding is you have to have a permit to do that.
Correct.
And so when the Parks Department installs irrigation, you have to get a permit just like anybody else would.
That is correct.
And that permit requires that there be rain sensors on those irrigation systems. How well, in your experience over the last few years, do those rain sensors work in actually shutting down a system once rain starts falling?
I think technology has improved over the years, but we still have trouble with the rain sensors. And so we don't rely on them. If we know it's going to rain, if we see the cloud coming, hopefully it won't divide out and split and go around San Angelo like it does sometimes. But again, we'll usually start the process of turning off systems. Sometimes we'll wait to see, if it's going to start raining. And again, I go back to the central control unit. We can actually do that by phone, by computer, by iPad. We can actually start turning off systems with that as well. And so, yes, they're good to have, but I wouldn't rely on them. We've had a lot of issues over the years with them malfunctioning. And you think that everything is good, and the next thing you know, you're getting the calls that the system's on when it's raining.
And so they're not foolproof.
Just like everything else.
All right. And so if people see a sprinkler system going in a city park while it's raining, then again, call your guys, and you'll be happy to shut that off.
Absolutely.
I assume it presents some challenges whenever it's raining in one part of the city but not another part of the city.
We watch the radars very, very closely in our department, yes.
So do you also use drip irrigation?
Yes. Yeah, we have actually some sites that even have turf under drip. We have one area down by the river stage that has a small area with drip, and then City Hall. All of the turf grass at City Hall is with drip irrigation. And then all of our landscape beds, our gardens, and our newly planted trees in our parks are on drip. Not the mature trees, but the newly planted trees have drip irrigation.
And that obviously is perhaps the most efficient use of water because there's no evaporation whatsoever whenever you're applying it under the soil directly to the plants.
Yes, it's a great method to use, unfortunately. There are people that use too much water with drip. And so again, going back to measuring how many square feet you have, how many gallons are you using, how many gallons are you putting out, you can do some calculations to figure out whether you're still putting out an inch I've known people, I've done demonstration plots when I was with the Extension Service, where I had people using 3 times the amount with drip on gallons per square foot versus somebody that had turf right next door. And so, yes, it's a great method, but it's not a guaranteed savings unless you pay attention to what you're doing.
Unless you manage it like you
Correct.
guys do. And I assume that the soil probes probably come into play there as well.
That and again, the number of emitters you have, the number of gallons you put out, how big an area you're covering, all of those things come into play.
Do you utilize hand watering?
Some. In our gardens, newly planted trees, things of that nature, yes. But again, it's very labor intensive, and so we try to minimize that as much as possible.
You mentioned about trees. Is there a concerted effort to save trees, particularly along the Concho River where we lost a lot of trees during the drought of 2011?
Yes, the Concho River project, the improvement project that was completed, I want to say in 2012, 2013, we have an irrigation system that has drip irrigation to the newly planted trees, but an underground irrigation system to everything from Veterans Memorial Drive to the river on that side. Santa Fe Golf Course is different. It has its own underground irrigation system that was installed back in around 2002. And so we've actually, over the last month, have been taking the efforts to go out and even with 1,000-gallon tanks, water tanks, we're even going in now and doing some work with the irrigation system that's in place, working with the contracted group 2Pro to try to get those trees watered as well.
You know, I've also heard complaints about the water lily gardens at Civic League Park. Of course, water lilies need water, and so people naturally assume that the water lily collection, which is one of the best in the world, is a major user of water and uses a lot of water. Is that belief correct, or is that a fallacy?
It does use water, but not to a great extent. Usually the water that's lost, you get some evaporation, but some of it is can land in draining some of those to put some fresh water back in. And again, when you look at the numbers, it's not a substantial amount of water as compared to other things or other sites.
So obviously, if people see something that they think is amiss or they have a question, they're always welcome to address that to us at our Facebook page, and we will relay that to you. But if they want to contact you directly, what are the best ways that people can get in touch with the Parks Department if they have some question or concern about watering in a park?
Certainly. You can email me at Roger, R-O-G-E-R, .Havlak, H-A-V-L-A-K, at COSATX.us. Or you can contact us, 325-659-8563 or 325-657-4279.
So we've been talking with Roger Havlak. He is our Parks Senior Manager for the City of San Angelo. And again, just want to make clear to you folks, if you have some question or concern during this broadcast, you're welcome to post a question or a comment, and we will respond to that. Just as a reminder, we're in drought level 1. That means we have 24 months of available water supply. Now that's a worst case scenario that assumes we would get no rainfall or runoff into our lakes over that 2-year period. So while there is a need for us to be very conscious and mindful of our water usage, it is not a critical situation. It's a serious situation, but it's not a critical situation. And so watering is restricted to once a week, 1 inch per week, and never between the hours of noon and 6 p.m. And it's always, regardless of the time of year, regardless of what drought stage we're in, it's always a violation to allow water to run more than 150 feet from your property. So again, if you have questions or comments or concerns, please post them. We'll be happy to respond to them. And just remember, we need you to do your part and be water smart.